Street is next to you.
No, she's not. She's in a different room.
Let's see. Which language did you choose?
I chose Portuguese.
Can you check another language? Is still there is the same problem?
Okay, let me try a different one. Okay, I have chosen a different one. Sounds better at the moment. Thank you. I'll just continue for now.
Okay.
I'll share my screen. This is my fourth study.
We don't see the okay. Yes, no, yes. Thank you.
Okay, I didn't quite hear that, Barbara. Were you saying you couldn't see my screen?
Yeah, but now we can see your screen. Sorry.
Okay. So a quick summary of yesterday's study. I tried to summarize thousands of years of history, which is not a very easy thing to do. But my hope was that we can see that the events of the 2024 election did not happen in a vacuum. And they were uniquely significant. Because it represented a stage of understanding that humanity has never reached before. Not to this extent. And as explained by Curtis, it is the realization that worth cannot be tied to what you do or what you have achieved. So I'll summarize again. We had early patriarchy in the ancient world. And I have defined patriarchy in this context as a system of winners and losers. You could say the strong versus the weak. The strong will almost always win. Society was organized around agriculture. People lived in villages. You also had cities, but they were not as large and sophisticated as the cities that came later. And social life was organized around the family and the tribe. Then we fast forward to the 1700s. With the Industrial Revolution. Machines begin to do a lot of the work. That humans used to do. And so slavery is eventually abolished. A lot of people start living in cities. And people start organizing around unions and political parties. This introduced the age of mass politics. Another way to say it is politics with a lot of people involved. And because it was the continuation of this system of winners and losers, of intergenerational wealth, those that had wealth were the ones that ended up being the leaders of industry. And they just got richer. So in early patriarchy, you had empires as winners. In early patriarchy, you had empires as winners. I think I lost my translator. I just want to confirm if people can still hear me.
Yes, yes, we do.
Okay, so I'll switch translators then. So I was saying, in early patriarchy, the winners were the empires. The losers were generally the slaves. In the industrial age, the winners were the industrialists, and the losers were the workers and their families. So it was slightly better than being a slave, maybe much better, but there was still a lot of bad treatment. They lived and worked in very unhealthy conditions. Even children were made to work in those conditions. So a few people got rich and the rest struggled. So naturally, people would become angry. And what we ended up seeing was World War One and World War Two. And the rise of communism and fascism. What people were basically saying is we want to be treated with more respect. We are worth something. So that anger caused a lot of destruction. But that's what they were basically trying to say. We fast forward again to the 1940s onwards. We have the beginning of the liberal international order. I called it globalization. Basically, democracies responded out of fear. Fear that communism or fascism would replace them. And they said we need to take better care of our people. So that they don't become communists and so that they don't become fascist. So it's in this history, the mid to late 1900s, that democracies came to understand this concept. That you can use state power to fix inequality. I want us to remember this point because it will become significant in the future. They thought state power could fix inequality. So you can just pass laws to correct inequality. Or have judicial rulings to fix inequality. But as we shall see, that was only a temporary solution. It doesn't work anymore. So in this age of globalization, we had a new class of winners and a new class of losers. So I'm using the language that they normally use to describe these two classes. The winners were the professionals. They mean those with degrees. And then the losers were the working class. People that worked in manufacturing, for example, that worked in factories. They lost their jobs. They lost a lot of money. Some even lost their homes. But the professional class continued to get richer. And people got upset about that. And so we had a backlash, which we are still experiencing today. People are saying destroy the liberal international order because it has been an unequal system. And these people are not completely wrong. In fact, in many ways, they're very correct. For as much as patriarchy has taken care of us, for very long, about 6,000 years, in our understanding, what people were saying in 2024 is we are tired of being losers. We want to be winners. So whether they recognized it or not, they were saying this system of winners and losers is no longer working and it needs to be done away with. So when the Democrats warned Americans in 2024 that Trump was a threat to democracy, enough of them said, if your democracy has created winners and losers, then we embrace that threat. We don't care that Trump is a threat. We want him to destroy that system. Because it hasn't worked for us. And humanity had reached a very important stage at that point. So this is a portion of the same history. And the only point I want to make on this line right now is that the 1930s to the 1980s was a high point for left-wing parties in democracies. But things begin to change in the 1970s. With Reagan and Thatcher. And then later on, Clinton and Blair on the left. And they say we'll replace the liberal consensus with a new liberal consensus, which is what neoliberal means. But under this setup, right-wing parties were becoming more ascendant. This consensus collapsed in 2021. It was falling apart progressively. But I mark 2021 firstly because of January 6th, where voter anger was now boiling over. Voters were becoming publicly angry. That's why they attacked the Capitol building. But I also mark 2021 because of Biden's governing style. Biden started pursuing policies that were against free trade. Whether it was a new Cold War with China, or some of the legislation that he tried to get through. Like the Inflation Reduction Act. So Biden was governing in a way that was far more responsive to populist anger. So the neoliberal dream was falling apart. But even though I say all of this, Biden was still a globalist at heart. And he still tried to balance globalist concerns with populist concerns. So when you get to the 2024 election, people are fed up with the Democrats. And they say enough is enough. We've always placed this idea of a full cup at the Sunday meal. And we've always pictured the anger there being God's anger. I'm not suggesting that God was not angry in 2024. Because any parent would be angry if their children are not taken care of. But what I want us to see about 2024 is that people were angry. And the system's cup was full. People decided enough is enough. So humanity and God were in agreement in 2024. Humans were angry, God was angry. But they were not angry at a person. They were angry at a system. They called that system the LIO. But what I'm saying is that what they were really angry about is patriarchy, a system designed for winners and losers. Said we don't want this anymore. That summary of what we were looking at yesterday. Today, I want us to continue looking at Christianity. We want to explore the history of the Christian system in the plan of salvation until we get to 2024. And hopefully we'll be able to come to the conclusion that, like the LIO, the Christian framework's time was up. So the Christian framework sorry, just give me a moment, having a technical issue. I apologize for that. So we are now discussing the Christian framework. And what I was saying is, the Christian framework introduced this idea of freedom and equality. I'll just call it early Christianity. So we know Paul taught that all people are equal in Christ. But Christianity introduced this idea in a patriarchal setting. So you still have winners and losers. Remember, the winners are the empires during this time, and the losers are the slaves. That hasn't changed. So Paul will still say, slaves, submit. And he'll still say, women, submit. So this is not equality. So there was clearly a problem. But it didn't end there. Christianity maintained a submission model When it came to God, Paul said God was the man and the woman is the church. And says, wives, submit to your husbands. And says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. And submission simply means obey without question. I hope we can all see this is a patriarchal model. So what happened is the church became what Old Testament prophets had been. So you had God, you had a mediator, and then you had the people. So in the Old Testament, Old Covenant, the mediator was the prophet. In the New Covenant, for their time, the church became that mediator. So what that meant is that the church was the voice of God. And if you wanted access to God, you no longer get it by consulting the prophet or the priest. You'd go to the church. So this had implications for salvation and how salvation worked. Because the Christian church became the gatekeeper. And the church's creed became what was used for life or death. Obey the creed, you have life. Disobey the church creed, you will die. You can change the word creed for belief, it's the same thing. So I'm not saying this was bad. I'm saying this was necessary. In the future, we'll hopefully go into this history more. But I'll just say today, it was necessary to protect the church. It wasn't really about protecting individual rights. or meeting individual needs. So some needs were met. Christianity was better at meeting people's needs than ancient religions. That's why a lot of people joined the Christian church. Because what Christianity taught, probably more than any other religion at the time, was that a human being is worth something. Not because they are a king, but because they're human. Christianity taught that God came to die for humans. That in the eyes of God, a slave and a free person were the same. And that a woman was as much a part of the kingdom of God as a man was. So there was definitely progress, but it was far from complete because it was still working within this patriarchal framework. So what resulted was the 1260. You had a situation where the church banished or killed those that didn't agree with the church. In the past, we were taught to look at the papacy as evil. But what I want us to see is that the papacy was just following the model that Paul taught. The submission model. Obey God without question. But since you can't see God, you can only get to God through the mediator. And the mediator is the church. The church will tell you what is correct to believe, and will tell you what is not correct to believe. If you believe, you live. If you do not believe, you die. This was both literally and in the future. So you would be saved if you believe what the church taught, and you would be thrown in hellfire if you don't. So in the 1260, you also had your winners and losers. In a Christian world, a world run by Christians. So I'll just say it this way, but it might not be totally correct. The winners were the church, and the losers were, I'll just say, the world. What I really mean is that the people that believed what the church said or accepted it, they could have been kings, they were winners. Not only were they going to be saved, but they got rich. Kings and priests made lots of money during the 1260. And they used the Christian model to achieve that. So some became very rich, and others were left very poor. And what resulted was a backlash. So the backlash started in this history. I'll summarize it by just calling it the Enlightenment, even though it's more complicated. The idea that life, liberty, and happiness are inalienable rights. No one can take those rights away from you. Not the church and not God. And this was done because Christianity abused people. And again, I don't want to suggest that this was an evil plan, but it was the consequence of teaching equality and freedom in the sight of God in a patriarchal world, a patriarchal system. So people would be drawn to Christianity because it had very good principles. They would develop respect for the religion. But those that ended up being leaders in that system ended up hurting those they were meant to take care of. By killing people that disagreed and rewarding people that agreed. But humanity came to a point where they were tired of that. So we get into the history of democracies and the decline of Christian governments. But another thing that happened in this history is the Great Awakenings. So I'll mark them here. I'll mark them under 1798. But I'm fully aware that they began before 1798. But the part I want to focus on is post 1798. So the Great Awakenings taught very important principles. They taught personal conversion, a direct relationship with God. They taught free will, personal salvation, and the point that I want to highlight is that anyone can become a religious leader. Not the established priestly class. So people were taught that they have agency. So they would make decisions for themselves. And why this was important is allowed for the rise of the Millerite movement. So ordinary people became leaders. Miller was an ordinary person. Jo Joseph Smith was an ordinary person. So we see the Mormon church and the Millerites rising at the same time. People were being given freedom to explore religion. So between history we already know, between 1798 and 1844, we have the rise of Adventism. The Millerite movement. And it's the awakenings that created the freedom for the Millerite movement to rise. But after October 22nd, early Adventism began to grapple with a reality. They needed to organize. They could not continue in the free spirit of the time. Otherwise, their movement would eventually collapse. So I've talked about these people in the past, the Millerites in the past. And I tried to explain that they had a Christian mindset. So they had this mindset of God, mediator, and the people. A mindset of submission. We know that Adventism is a prophetic movement. So their organization, I'm saying, is based on submission. And mediatorship. And what they're going to use now is not just the church creed, it's a prophetic understanding of the end of the world. So in this system, they retain this idea that ordinary people can become leaders. But in order to be a leader, they never really said it this way. But the best students of prophecy became the leaders. At least that was the intention. What ended up happening is you did have good students of prophecy becoming the leaders, but prophecy also became a sorting mechanism. Like education in the liberal international order, prophecy would determine the winners and the losers. And we all know this because what they taught was Adventism, the church, has a message, prophetic message, about Sabbath and Sunday. And what they said is, everyone that's not part of us is part of the world. And if you're going to live You have to listen to us. Those that don't accept the Sabbath truth and the third angel's message were going to face the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture. So STAs became the winners, and the world, the unbelieving world, became the losers. Hopefully, we've seen this enough times now to see it for what it is. It is patriarchy framed in religious language, framed in prophetic language. But again, I want to be clear. I'm not attacking the Christian system, and I'm not attacking the Adventist system. Just like I was not attacking the LIO. What I am doing is identifying the weakness of these systems. They were all based on this model of winners and losers. Even though they gave a lot of good to humanity. So Adventism gave a lot of space for contribution of knowledge. You had this idea of regular lines of work, and irregular lines. You could call them independent ministries. And this idea of having irregular lines or independent ministries is what actually allowed for our movement to rise within Adventism. For those that know the history of our movement enough, they'll be aware that our movement has interacted with the conference, the STA conference, and has also interacted with independent ministries in Adventism. And they've debated over religious and prophetic subjects. So I'm fast forwarding. We come to 1989. The Soviet Union falls. And this kickstarts the rise of our movement. And we have Adventist roots, of course. An ordinary person rises up and teaches the truth. His name is Jeff Pippinger. Didn't have to wait for a theologian for the truth to develop. So the point I want to make is there was lots of freedom in Adventism. But the cost of freedom in a patriarchal religious environment is that this system also allowed for cults of personality. So the best prophecy students often became voices so they became voices that people would listen to without question. Questioning these students of prophecy became equivalent to questioning and disagreeing with God. So the model was no longer just God and the church, being the mediator to the people. There was also this idea of messengers. Yes, messengers or angels, because the Adventist church believes in the three angels' messages. Externally, the church is the angel to the world. But internally, we developed a model of an angel to the church. So in early Adventism, just say the first angel was Miller. Second angel was Samuel Snow. And the third angel became Ellen White. This is subjective. It can be challenged. But it's a general understanding. So as we got to the end of Adventism, we applied the same model. And we said this first angel was Jeff Pippinger. It was said, even though there's question marks on this, but it was said in the past that Aminda Bryant is the second angel and that Tess Lambert was the third angel. And what this meant is that listen to these messengers, don't question them. If you question them, You're actually questioning God, and you will lose your salvation. So you end up having a system of winners and losers within the movement. The winners are those that agree with these teachers, and the losers are those that don't. And in a patriarchal setup, where people just follow their favorite teachers, what ended up happening in this whole period is a lot of good teachers stood up. A lot of good students of prophecy stood up. And they started competing to become angels. For those that have been in this movement long enough, you will know what I'm talking about. People fighting to be the next Samuel Snow. After it was established that Jeff Pippinger was the reformer. And what ended up happening is a lot of shakings and splits. Because different cults of personality would lead away a lot of members who were not used to a culture of questioning. So a lot of innocent people got hurt. So what I want us to see in all this is not that we had some humble teachers and some proud teachers. What I want us to see is that we had freedom to study prophecy in a system that was designed for winners and losers. So those who are wise and those who are wicked. After all, the everlasting gospel was a three-step testing message that separated two classes of worshippers. So you can call them the wise and the foolish. You can call them whatever you want. It ended up being the same thing as this patriarchal system that we studied yesterday. The empires and the slaves, the industrialists and the workers, the professionals and the working class. And Curtis tried to explain that these professionals became a meritocracy. And they believed that they deserved their position. And therefore, that those that were not successful also deserved their position. So having freedom in this Adventist system unintentionally made people believe that if you remain in the movement or you follow the best teachers, you somehow deserve salvation. And if you don't, if you leave the movement, or you question and you don't agree, then you also deserve to be thrown in hell. Another point I want to raise in this context is that historically disadvantaged people also suffered. So I'll just use women as an example. Women could not study very well in that environment. Prophecy was mostly seen as a male exercise. So they would do most of the cooking and the planning. And those women that were brave enough to get into these prophetic discussions were seen as bold and forward, that they were coquettes, in the words of Ellen White. It wasn't a friendly environment for people to study together as equals. It was not. Yes. So what I hope we have been able to see with this study is that this system was not, it was not perfect. It was not built to handle uh, disagreement under stress. It was good. It was good for a church that was still young and developing. But for a church that was reaching maturity, A new model was required altogether. Which is why you'll notice that a lot of the public shakings and splits we used to have that caused a lot of pain and trauma, they don't exist anymore. And it's not because we've got better people now and we had terrible people then. It's because we changed the model. We changed from patriarchy, which is this system of winners and losers, to equality, where everyone's a winner. Everyone is a winner. So winners and losers. And then here we just have winners. And people are freely allowed to question their teachers. With no fear for their salvation. So this change was progressive, but 2024 was a major turning point. When the QFMG studies went public, I'm sure we all remember what happened. There was a lot of questioning. There were different teachers that came up with different views. And people were not used to this. They were afraid of it. And they actually wanted Paminda to give the answer. And that didn't happen. For multiple reasons, probably. But the reason that I want to point out is because it was time for a change. It was time to reject this mediator model. And time for us to learn a better way of studying and working together. That people can actually disagree and not be tears. It began to be taught in this dispensation, in fact. That teaching incorrect views doesn't make you a tear. It's how humans learn. So it was more in agreement with our nature. Another point that began to be emphasized Was that the responsibilities of institutions and the responsibilities of individuals were different? So the LIO said, what's good for the system is good for the individual. And that was a disaster. Companies got richer, countries got richer, but the small person, individuals, suffered. So before we moved from patriarchy to equality, there was an increase of knowledge. We learned a lot of things, but individuals suffered. And we had to come to a point where we recognize that this doesn't work anymore. There's a better way. Your salvation is not dependent on your belief system. It's based on your humanity. Like Curtis said, you have rights because you exist. And hopefully that frees all of us to more confidently and freely study these subjects. And be actually able to understand truth far better than we had in the past. You don't have to depend on a mediator in the church. Don't have to depend on a teacher. Can study together. And we can all become good students of prophecy. That's an agreement with the new covenant promise that there shall no man teach you to know the Lord. Because everyone will know God, from the greatest to the least. So when we got to 2024, with the recognition that patriarchy is being set aside, the world says no more unequal system. We needed to see things the same way. Which means no more church versus the world. Our organization is working alongside other organizations. To understand our nature and to understand our world. No more wise versus the wicked. Because all of this is based on the patriarchal model. So the last point that I want to bring up as we close is that if we go back to the beginning, Eden, when humans were created, there was no such thing as the church in the world. What you had was humanity. Everyone was going to understand spirituality, if I can call it that, and participate in every other aspect of human life. So, where did this church and world thing come from? It came as a result of transgressions. Elder Tess has taught in the past that the tree of knowledge of good and evil was a vote. So what they voted for was that Satan's model of government was legitimate. So from this point, humanity was now going to have to choose whether they wanted God's model or Satan's model. And because it was still the beginning, immature, the difference wasn't very clear. So a lot of faith had to be used. I'll just call it faith. Those that agreed with God's model became the church. And those that accepted Satan's model became the world. But we are living in the time of the end, where we know everything is restored to its Edenic beauty. And what brings an end to this separation is also a vote, a more sophisticated vote. And what they were saying, as I said already, no more unequal system. The two systems had developed well enough. Humanity had experienced them enough to know that inequality does not feel nice. So the people that we despised for voting for Donald Trump and bringing an end to the liberal international order are actually the people who fulfilled the requirement to take us back to the Edenic model. Because what they were rejecting, whether they recognized it or not, is this model. So now you'd have no more church and world, but humanity. So when we go to the repeating pattern, which we've used for so long, and we talk about Boston, Concord, Exeter, and the Chateau. There's a lot I can say about this model. But allow me to summarize it this way. Baked into this model was that there was a test here. Because the messenger formalized a message, listen to what that messenger says. You become a winner. You don't listen, you're a loser. And you can call it whatever you want. You can put death decree here. Same problem. The church is the good ones, and the enemies of the church are the world, and they're the bad ones. And they're trying to kill the church. It's all based on this polarizing model. Which is no longer fit for purpose. This vote of 2024 was meant to show us no more inequality. We need equality for everyone. And this is not equality for everyone. Next time, we'll begin to look at the significance of 2026. Because what we've been focused on is the change from the old to the new covenant in the context of Adventism. Which is 2024. Showing us how we as the church became united with the world under one system. One system of prophetic understanding. When we start looking at 2026, there is another us and them that comes to an end there. And the us here is humanity. And the them, I'll just say heaven. and the other worlds. Let's pray. Dear God, I am forever grateful for the privilege and opportunity to study this message alongside others who are interested in the things that I'm interested in. Thank you for the beauty of equal rights. It helps me to see why under the new covenant, everyone can indeed love the law. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you so much, Blessing, for the presentation. Sorry, could I please just do one thing? So these are very interesting truths that we're learning. And for us, probably a lot is going on in our minds. And most of what has been taught today reminded me of how much scary it is to look ahead and get a hold of the freedoms that we're given. When all we have known is slavery. So slavery is familiar to most of us. But the freedom that is being given to us has more to offer. So let's just take that step and discover what lies before us. So what we have, I think we should have 2 more presentations coming, if I'm not mistaken, in the coming weeks. And we hope to meet there again. And since it is a beautiful Sabbath, we'll just have an opportunity to greet, see each other, and be happy together, cry together. Whatever we're feeling because of what's happening. Okay.